This is Columbus, Indiana, through the eyes of a normal pedestrian. And this is also Columbus, Indiana, through the lens of South Korean indie filmmaker Kogonada in 2017. Both emphasized on the same thing: architecture. We see it everywhere in our lives, but can often become oblivious to the wonders thereof, due to our natural day-to-day obstacles that tug on our cognitive attention. And it is only when we stand still that we can appreciate the beauty of it, and in some cases, have us learn something about ourselves and about each other. But you can sense a more intimate nature between the architecture and the viewer that is separate from our day-to-day observations. But the most important thing about these two shots is not that the architecture changes, but the perception of the viewer. And that is precisely what is driven to focus in Kogonada's 2017 indie drama film, Columbus. So today, I want to investigate this film through both the lens of a filmgoer and an architectural admirer, to see how a film can construct a story according to architectural conventions, and articulate the two character arcs that are influenced by the passive presence of modern architecture. Let's have a look at Columbus.
What's up?
Want to catch a film tonight?
At face value, this is a film that doesn't really speak much. Literally, this film has less dialogue than the average drama film, and the cinematography is next to the mobility of none. Because the subject matter within the story, in this case architecture, is used in a very passive manner. Architecture is a very uncommon and unpopular medium to be used in writing, because it is very difficult to dramatize and cinematize, mainly because of how passive it is. And when filmmakers do use it, it is seldom used to make fun of it, or used in a very over-the-top way. So in order to tell a story architecturally, Kogonada uses very subtle techniques to fill his spaces and awareness of architecture through the camera lens, and all is used to construct the character narratives of Jin and Cassandra.
I want to show you something.
It's late.
The first technique he uses to construct his shots architecturally is passive circulation, referring to the medical principle that forms part of the anatomy of the human heart. Circulation is the substantive mobility and movement that brings life into a space and harmony between the dweller and the dwelling. Kogonada frequently uses static camera placement to inspire the viewer to focus on how people move through these spaces and what emotion their body language expresses. Some of these dwellers remain within the functional commodity of the space, expressing a sort of passive harmony, whether that be by watering the plants or reading books. But only one person is shown to harmonize actively within the space, a young woman and part-time librarian, Cassandra. She often expresses a jovial attitude when she is in the foreground, and the camera will often show us this to tell us how she is feeling. But she is not the only person who has an indifference to their surroundings. A young man, and ironically the son of an architect, Jin. He moves through these spaces with a sense of oblivion, where he only acknowledges the direction he moves, and not where he is, as he waits on his coma-induced father, an architect he doesn't really admire. All of this is meant to establish a visual foundation as to how we can interpret the emotions and mental states of these characters. Cassandra is free-spirited. She is always portrayed to be in an absolute awe of her surroundings. This is in contrast to Jin, whose expressions are uninspired. And this use of passive and static camera placements can often emphasize how spaces can figuratively evolve. Take this shot of an alleyway corridor. Visually, it remains the same, but in spirit, you can sense a sort of progression and the way people move through it, with the subtle implications of different light presences.
You said this is one of your favorite buildings.
It is.
Why?
According to a theoretical study by Le Corbusier on continuity, to be modern is not a fashion, it is a state. It is necessary to understand history, and he who understands history knows how to find continuity between that which was, that which is, and that which will be. If you reinterpret this line in a thematic sense, you can start to see how both Jin and Cassandra's characters are molded by the use of architecture, all in how they understand their past trauma, their grim present, and their unclear future. And it also relates to the second technique Kogonada uses, which is the idea of hierarchy through contrast. In her very first scene, Cassandra reflects on the design of a local church, one of the first in America to be designed according to the conventions of modernism. Columbus is filled with architectural precedents from this movement that originated in the early 20th century, used to emphasize simplistic and linear designs as a means to popularize rational and economic construction without the distractions of ornamentation. But as Le Corbusier stated, the precedents in Columbus are not viewed as a fashion of the film, but as a vessel, a catalyst for character development. The church is a vessel to show the hierarchy through asymmetry and contrast. The cross is off-centered, and Kogonada uses this to establish a hierarchy to drive the direction of the scenes between how Cassandra and Jin move. When the film stands still, it asks us to observe these spaces passively. Most of the film comforts itself with this stationary cinematography to tune us into the spirit of architecture. And it is when both Jin and Cassandra meet for the first time that the state of the cinematography turns from passive to active, signaling a personal connection between the two, and establishing a form of hierarchy in their first interaction. But he also uses contrast to internally characterize Cassandra, and especially Jin, in a more deliberate sense. In a scene between Cassandra and her friend, Gabriel makes this argument about people with short attention spans.
See, what he's saying is that this boy is actually able to give hours of attention to a video game because it's interesting to him.
But that's because video games are designed for people with short attention spans.
Not a matter of attention, but of interest. He's able to pay attention for hours if he finds something interesting.
Jin is a middle-aged businessman and is also hinted to be a writer, but where he starts out in the film can be summarized entirely by this piece of dialogue. He is impatient, short-minded, and even participates in the thrill of puzzles and games, because that is the only thing he finds interesting. He has a very short span of attention for architecture, and when he meets Cassandra, he has little interest in her intellect in architecture, and instead wants to know her within a personal sense.
You said this is one of your favorite buildings.
It is.
Why? Do you like this building intellectually because of all the facts?
I'm also moved by it.
Yes. Yes, tell me about that. What moves you?
He asks her why she is so emotionally attached to it, but instead of giving us a material explanation, Kogonada implements the first use of music to strengthen the ambiguity of passive architecture. But it is precisely because of his interest in her as a person that he eventually starts to grow an appreciation for architecture. After each time they investigate a new building, he becomes more and more captivated by it, taking pictures, going on tour guides, and even learning from his father's work. While at the same time, his self-objectivist demeanor starts to challenge Cassandra to observe her past and present, as she expresses her interest in studying architecture. Their contrasting characteristics invite mild conflict and change, all while the vessels behind them stay passive as the story progresses and as they explore more and more precedents. They eventually reinvent their perceptions of themselves, but it is also used to invite the challenge of past trauma. Cassandra reflects on her mother's addiction when she observes her third favorite building, and Jin reflects on his father's negligence during his youth. And it isn't until their relationship reaches a climax that they submit to the new change. Cassandra embraces her interest in studying her passion, and Jin's mind is open to her passions. all are articulated through the lens of architecture. I will admit, all of this is very subtle, and whether you read this with thematic intent or not does not matter. But that is the beauty of architecture. It can be viewed through many perspectives because even though as much as in the same breath as art, architecture doesn't change, but your perception of it does. And that passive exterior can ask you to aware yourself of your surroundings. Surroundings that can tune you into peace and harmony. Kogonada's Columbus is very brilliant because it is not just a film about architecture. The architecture is the film.